On a Saturday morning in early January 1936 at Westminster School in London, the delegates of the Classical Association gathered for the last day of the annual general meeting. At 11 a.m, a young man of 23 took the stage and delivered the lecture titled "The War and its Aftermath in Their Influence upon Thucydidean Studies." The young man was John Enoch Powell, Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and one of the rising stars of British classical scholarship. In this video, I will discuss Powell's unpublished paper, setting it against the background of Powell's academic and political career. Basically, what Powell did in 1936 was use Thucydides' analysis of the Peloponnesian War to define World War I and the upcoming World War II as a sole great conflict. When he delivered his speech, he was very much aware that the conflict did not end with the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, and used Thucydides to reinforce his idea. We are faced here with an interaction between ancient author and present needs in politics and war. But before tackling Powell's paper directly, a brief introduction to our main character. John Enoch Powell was born in Birmingham in 1912. He was educated at King Edward's School for Boys in Birmingham and obtained a scholarship to attend Trinity College, Cambridge in 1930. He was a brilliant, if somewhat eccentric, student and collected a number of important academic prizes. He was elected Fellow under Title A at Trinity in 1934, a fixed-term position which is very competitive and prestigious. He then obtained the Chair of Greek at the University of Sydney in 1938 at the age of 25, and was designated Professor of Greek at Durham University from January 1940. However, war broke out on 1 September 1939 and Powell took the first flight back to England and immediately enlisted in the army. He concluded the war as a brigadier, but then opted for a political career in the Conservative Party. He was elected MP for Wolverhampton South West in 1950 and remained continually at Westminster until 1987. His political career has been controversial and divisive, to say the least. His 1968 Rivers of Blood speech is still one of the best known and discussed political speeches of post-World War II British politics. Powell's glaring eyes, thrilling voice and villainous moustache made his physical presence both hypnotic and sinister. It has been reported that Harold Macmillan, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1957 to 1963, couldn't stand having Powell opposite him in cabinet, looking, quote, like Savonarola eyeing one of the more disreputable popes. Now, I will not talk about Powell's political career, which is well known and I should say notorious. What I will focus on instead is his academic career, that is the years 1930 to 1939, which is when war broke out and he abandoned academia for good, even though he continued to do some occasional work until 1950. He published his first article in German in 1931, and by 1940 he had published 48 articles in various international journals. He was also the author of several books: the Randall Harris Papyri of Woodbrook College, Birmingham, a Lexicon to Herodotus, an edition of Herodotus, Book 8, the History of Herodotus, and the revised text and Apparatus Criticus of Jones's edition of Thucydides for the Oxford Classical Texts, which eventually appeared in 1942. Finally, he also translated Herodotus' Ionic Greek into the English of King James Bible. 2 volumes were published by Oxford Clarendon Press in 1949. As you can see from this list of books and editions, the young Powell devoted much of his initial academic attention to Herodotus, but he also managed to revise Jones's text of Thucydides for OCT. Moreover, he also published 7 articles on Thucydides, which are mainly devoted to textual criticism and manuscript tradition, and are still useful today, and 5 book reviews regarding Thucydides. Now, this is only a portion of Powell's Thucydidean studies. In fact, both the Wren Library of Trinity College and Churchill Archive Centre of Churchill College in Cambridge preserve quite a lot of unpublished material that Powell donated to these 2 institutions. Among the boxes at the Wren Library, we can find lecture notes on Thucydides, a text titled A Proposal for an Edition of Thucydides, dated 5 June 1937, translations of passages from Thucydides, photographic reproductions, collations of manuscripts, and so on. Between 1933 and 1935, before and during his fellowship at Trinity, Powell travelled widely in Italy. He repeatedly visited Venice, Florence, Rome, Parma, Turin, and Naples, and the Wren Library preserves various letters from Italian libraries granting Powell access to their manuscripts. From this fact, and from these documents, we might suppose that Powell formed his ideas about Italian fascism directly in Italy. He was in fact very critical of Mussolini's regime. He also travelled to Germany, where he met various colleagues and got acquainted, among others, with the Jew classical scholar Paul Maas. In 1939, Powell saved Maas from deportation and certain death by obtaining for him a visa to enter England. Maas died in Oxford in 1964, revered as arguably the most important textual critic of the 20th century. If we turn our attention to the Churchill Archive Centre, we'll find that it preserves even more unpublished papers by Powell. The most important one, and the longest one as well, is the Moral and Historical Principles of Thucydides and Their Influence in Later Antiquity, his fellowship dissertation. Then we have the Moral and Political Ideas of Thucydides, the papyri and the text of Thucydides, the manuscripts of Thucydides at Venice and Cambridge, and finally the war and its aftermath in their influence upon Thucydidean studies. The last piece in this list, which I have introduced at the very beginning. This text was presented, as I was saying, at the annual general meeting of the Classical Association in January 1936, and a brief resume was published in the Proceedings of the Classical Association of the same year. However, it went almost unnoticed, at least until Ben Early discussed it in his recent book, The Thucydidean Turn. You can find Ben's video on the present YouTube channel. So this is how the young Powell began his address. Ladies and gentlemen, the effect of the late war upon classical scholarship has not, in general, been a beneficent one. The almost total cessation of work during the war itself, the removal of a rising generation of scholars, the impoverishment of the defeated powers, and latterly the economic and financial difficulties which have greatly hindered the free circulation of literature and ideas. All these have been prejudicial to healthy research. Nevertheless, the study of Thucydides has not been among the branches of classical research which have suffered by the war. It may be claimed that, on the contrary, it has rather profited by it. In mere bulk, the Thucydidean literature of the past 17 years is probably superior to that of any preceding period of equal length, not even excepting the last third of the 19th century, the heyday of German scholarship. In the following pages, Powell offers a very informed review of the publications that followed World War I, starting with a masterpiece of Thucydidean scholarship, Edward Schwarz's Das Geschichtswerk des Thucydides. Powell praised Schwarz in the preface to his The History of Herodotus of 1939, quote, that in spite of the restriction of my subject, Powell wrote, I have chosen to entitle this study The History of Herodotus, arises from a wish to indicate that I am here trying to do for Herodotus what Edward Schwarz did for another Greek historian in his brilliant Geschichtswerk des Thucydides, end quote. Powell sent the book to Schwarz in March 1939, and the accompanying letter in German survives. In this letter, Powell talks about his attitude towards the German nation and culture, calling it a mixed feeling of love and hate, ein seltsames Gemisch von Liebe und Hass, and hopes to be able to visit Germany during fall 1939 if the war does not stand in his ways. We notice here that Powell was expecting war to break out sooner rather than later. On the matter of war in Europe, as I was saying at the beginning, Powell was very much aware that it was going to take place already when he delivered his speech at the annual general meeting of the Classical Association in January 36. Thucydides defined the Peloponnesian War as a 30-year war between 431 and 404, with at least 3 distinct phases. He realized that the Achaemenian War, which began in 431 and ended with the peace treaty in 421, was only a portion of a larger conflict. After the peace agreement, Thucydides wrote, quote, "For 6 years and 10 months, the two sides refrained from military operations against each other's territory. But elsewhere, the truce had only tenuous effect, and they continued to inflict as much damage on each other as they could. And later on, they were compelled to abandon the treaty made after those 10 years and resort once again to open war." The conflict took a dramatic turn in 415 when the Athenians ventured on the Sicilian expedition, and ended famously with the fall of Athens and the destruction of the Long Walls in 404. Whatever Thucydides might have written before 404 BC regarding the conflict, it had to be reworked when he realized its true proportions and consequences. As Werner Jäger noticed long ago, it was the war that made Thucydides a historian. Now let us turn to what Powell wrote in 1936. Let us suppose that in 1925, say, a young Englishman addresses himself to a history of the Great War. It is to be a tragic whole, tracing German imperialism from its roots in the Napoleonic period to the final dissolution in 1918. He has made some progress with this scheme when events in Europe apprise him that the war of 1914-1918 was only part of a larger contest still undecided. In 1935 and 1936, he occupies himself by recording provisionally the isolated conflicts which verge towards a greater, after which he becomes a passive spectator or an active participant in the final struggle, until, as an elderly man in 1950, he can sit down to depict this great and now finished whole, conceived as the historically inevitable self-defense and fall of the British Empire, and justifying to the world that humane and consistent policy, which nevertheless might appear to have been the cause of the disaster. How much would the original draft require to be manipulated and altered before he admitted it into his finished work? And how great would be the contrast of tone between one stratum and another? This is not a very different situation from that with which we meet in the history of Thucydides, particularly in its first 2 books. It is evident that Powell used Thucydides' experience in order to reinforce his own ideas about the present political situation. Further in the paper, Powell shows his despise for pacifistic readings of Thucydides because he believed that these readings ignored, quote, Thucydides' ceaseless insistence on the changeless trends of human nature and the essential bipolarity of Greece, end of quote. But according to Powell, there is something even worse than pacifism in contemporary Thucydidean studies, and this is, quote, the national creed of modern Germany, end of quote. Powell briefly mentioned Mussolini's regime, whose ideological background was centered, as it is well known, around ancient Rome and the greatness of the Roman Empire, only to focus on Nazi Germany. A peculiar kinship has been detected between the ancient Greeks and modern Germans, the 2 purest and greatest examples of Aryan humanity. Not only the Greek civilization in general, but Thucydides in particular, has proved exceptionally congenial. The intensely political outlook of Thucydides may be made serviceable to a doctrine which asserts the absolute dominion of the state over every phase of individual existence. And as the more striking figures of Caesar and Augustus had already been captured as prototypes by Mussolini, Hitler might still be made to look very like Pericles, or Pericles rather to look like Hitler. Powell considered a number of German scholars, from Helmut Berwe to Werner Jaeger's last chapter of the first volume of Paideia, to show that political readings of Thucydides in Nazi Germany were widespread and indeed encouraged. He says, great stress is naturally laid on the famous description of Periclean Athens in 265, Egigne tote logo men demokratia, ergo deu potu protu andros arche. In English translation, what was taking place was a democracy by name, but in fact it was the rule of the leading men. Analogy is a powerful tool in historical analysis. Thucydides' text has always been employed to construct analogies between past events that he described and present situations. We have seen this mechanism taking place in Powell's reasoning regarding Thucydidean studies. Just like Thucydides realized that the conflict between Athens and Sparta lasted for 27 years from 431 to 404, so did Powell with the contemporary political international situation, where a rising Germany led by Hitler was compelled, Thucydides would have used the verb anankazo from ananke, necessity, was compelled to wage again war against its neighbours and the British Empire, despite the Paris Peace Agreement of 1919. The same happens today with scholars and policymakers. The most blatant case is certainly Graham Allison's book Destined for War, which I have recalled in the introduction to our YouTube channel. Equating Pericles with Hitler, as some German scholars did in the 1930s, is just another case of historical analysis, even though considered controversial then and now. One of Powell's concluding remarks in his unpublished paper includes the following statement, quote, "Study of the pitfalls into which contemporaries have fallen, of the blind alleys up which they have been led, may have a very real value for ourselves." And we can certainly agree with his evaluation. But why is this paper by a 23-year-old Cambridge scholar important for us in the 21st century, and why is it interesting from the point of view of Thucydidean reception in academia and politics in the past 100 years? Powell was a proponent of textual criticism as the highest product of intellectual labor. In one of his unpublished texts, preserved in the Wren Library, he called textual criticism, quote, "the ideal education and the queen of the human sciences." End of quote. So far, Powell's methods and academic outputs have always been considered strictly as philological, the only exception being perhaps Ben Early in his very recent book, The Thucydidean Turn. The paper that Powell delivered at the annual general meeting of the Classical Association in 1936 shows instead a great commitment to contemporary politics, a strong historical diachronic perspective, and an analysis of Thucydides' readings by British pacifists and German scholars influenced by the ideology of Nationalsozialismus. In my opinion, the unpublished paper delivered in 1936 shows the first traces of the future politician. However, you will not find in Powell's political speeches obvious references to Thucydides' work. He was perhaps too much aware of the pitfalls in attempting to squeeze ancient authorities in modern contexts. At the same time, we can trace Powell's understanding of international relations to his deep acquaintance with Thucydides' analysis of the great conflict between Athens and Sparta. As Camilla Schofield remarked in Enoch, Powell and the Making of Post-Colonial Britain, quote, "Powell's understanding of international relations was at least in part touched by his work on Thucydides, now read by students of international relations as one of the first proponents of a realist approach." End of quote. In fact, in Powell's fellowship dissertation, which lies still unpublished in the Churchill Archive Centre, he remarked, "If now Thucydides represents nations in any moment of action as but following out logically the consequences of their positions, and that position itself as brought about by the natural forces of human nature, it follows that he believed moral rules inapplicable to the conduct of nations or communities." Often we hear that Thucydides suppresses moral judgments. Rather, is moral judgment absent from the outset? for his standpoint is realpolitik, which considers what is, not what ought to be, and views morality and sentiment themselves as but a single force among the many whose interplay makes up the grand, unmoral, or indeed supermoral sweep of history. This passage displays Powell's commitment to an analysis of Thucydides' work from the perspective of realpolitik, which gained prominence only in the 1950s with the North American realist school of international relations. There is certainly more to be said on Powell's Thucydidean studies, especially in the light of his fellowship dissertation devoted to Thucydides. But we have at least had the opportunity to consider one fascinating unpublished paper that shows Powell tackling previous scholarship and at the same time making powerful analogies between the Peloponnesian War and contemporary events. He was certainly not alone among his contemporaries in claiming in 1936 that another great conflict was imminent. Perhaps not everybody in Britain was ready to hear this gloomy outcome.